Okay, let's take a look at another question. This one is, once again, a main point, main conclusion question. The stem reads, which one of the following most accurately expresses the conclusion drawn in the argument? So we're going to have to read this, slap labels, premise, conclusion labels on this, maybe even context, right? And once we identify what the conclusion is, we're going to look into the answers and try our best to paraphrase that conclusion. So main point, main conclusion question. Now, of course, we're going to utilize the previous lessons that talk about, well, lots of things, right? But I'll just highlight some of them. Phenomenon hypothesis, comparative statements, and the difference between conditional and factual claims. So first, let's take a look. Novel X and novel Y are both semi-autobiographical novels and contain many very similar themes and situations, which might lead one to suspect plagiarism on the part of one of the authors. However, what lesson is this conjuring? The difference between context and argument, right? So when the author says, however, the author is saying, okay, now pay attention. This is what I really want to tell you. It is more likely that the similarity of themes and situations in the two novels is merely coincidental, since both authors are from very similar backgrounds and have led similar lives. So this is the conclusion. This right here, this comparative claim, right? This comparative claim, it's more likely. This is the conclusion because both authors are from very similar backgrounds, have led very similar lives. Premise which supports this. But this isn't the only premise that supports this claim. You also have information up here in the context that matters too, because, and here let's invoke our phenomenon hypothesis framework, right? In terms of our phenomenon, what's going on? Well, we notice novel X and novel Y are both very similar, right? First of all, they're both semi-autobiographical, right? They have very similar themes and situations, right? Similar themes and similar situations. So here is the phenomenon set, right? Here's the phenomenon set. Now, from this set of phenomenon, the author is saying you might suspect plagiarism. Maybe this author copied this author, right? Maybe this author copied this author, which is what might explain the similarities. So the author is saying, yeah, it's possible that somebody would have this hypothesis of plagiarism, but that is not the hypothesis the author wants to draw. That's not the conclusion, right? The author is saying, actually, it's more likely, right? This other hypothesis is more likely. And this other hypothesis is that it's merely a coincidence. Do you see? This is the more likely hypothesis. It's a coincidence. Why? Well, here's another piece of information. Both authors had similar backgrounds and led similar lives. Right, so you now look at this more complete, right, this more complete phenomenon set, and you think to yourself, if this is my phenomenon set, which hypothesis am I going to go with, right? What better explains this phenomenon? Is it that one of them plagiarized the other? I mean, it's still possible, right? But our author is saying, no, it's more likely that it's the similarities here are just a coincidence, right? And you can see why, because they had similar lives, similar backgrounds. So it wouldn't be that surprising if their semi-autobiographical novels turn out to have similar themes and similar situations. Okay, so of course, a lot of this is kind of overkill on this question. Like, under a real timed setting, you're just trying to, once you find the conclusion, you're just trying to, right? But I'm not talking about any of that yet, right? And that, by that, I mean timing strategies, efficiency strategies, right? That's like improvements you make at the margins. I'm talking about right now fundamental issues. This is part of the core curriculum for logical reasoning. You have to know the difference between phenomenon and hypothesis. You have to understand comparative statements, right? You have to know the difference between conditional claims and factual claims, because it's not just about this question. Those are concepts that repeat over and over and over in different incarnations across different logical reasoning questions. So let's take a look at the answers. Which answer choice best paraphrases this conclusion? That it's more likely that the similarity of the theme situations in two novels is merely coincidental. Is it let's see, surely it can't be this answer choice, right? Because it says it's more likely and this one starts with it's less likely, right? That can't be right. See, that's what the outside writers want you to think. They're trying to hide the correct answer choice by intentionally using the opposite language. But we know from our comparative curriculum, if I say that I'm taller than you, that's equivalent to saying you're shorter than me. So if this hypothesis is more likely than this hypothesis, another way to equivalently say it is that plagiarism hypothesis is less likely than the coincidence hypothesis. And that's exactly what answer choice D is saying. It's saying that it is less likely that one of the authors is guilty of plagiarism, right? Plagiarism is less likely than what? Than the coincidental hypothesis. That's the same as saying the coincidental hypothesis is more likely than the plagiarism hypothesis. So there it is once again. It's in some ways the same trick that we saw in the first question, where the right answer choice gave us exactly the same concept, just a different phrasing, right? That one was formal logic. Not every X is a Y, some X's are not Ys. Here it's comparative, right? You're taller than me, I'm shorter than you. Yeah, same thing. Now, one other thing I want to point out before looking at the wrong answers is the implied nature of the comparative in this claim. Right? If you look at this, you might think, I don't spot the word than. What's going on? What's going on? It's that the than is implied, right? It's more likely than what? That the similarity themes is merely coincidental. More likely than what? You can only understand this in context. We just talked about the other potential hypothesis of plagiarism. In that context, do you see it makes more sense to say, oh, it's more likely than what? Than plagiarism, right? Merely coincidental. That hypothesis is the more likely hypothesis than this hypothesis. It's implied as opposed to explicit. Okay, let's take a look at the other answers now, starting with A, which says novel X and novel Y are both semi-autobiographical novels, and the two novels contain very similar themes and situations. I mean, yeah, this is all true and stuff, but it's not the conclusion. See, this is just reiterating stuff that we find in our context and the premise here, or you can think of it as it's just kind of picking from our set of phenomenon, right? It's like reiterating these things, but our job is to identify the conclusion. B says the fact that novel X and Y are both semi-autobiographical novels contain many very similar themes and situations might lead one to suspect plagiarism on part of the authors. Yeah, that's right. That's also part of the argument, right? But it's dismissed as the less likely hypothesis, whereas the conclusion is the more likely hypothesis, the one of coincidence, right? But A and B do reveal the fact that the LSAT writers like to put in to the answer choices as trap wrong answer choices, claims that are found elsewhere in the stimulus, right? Claims that serve other purposes. That's not the conclusion. And C does the same thing. The author of novel X and novel Y are from very similar backgrounds, have led very similar lives. That's just, we identify that as the premise, right? We identify that as premise. Or you can, again, think of it with the phenomenon hypothesis framework as just some subset of our phenomenon. Okay, now lastly, E is a super attractive answer choice. And its attractiveness, its very attractiveness, is the reason why I did the lesson, a standalone lesson on the distinction between conditional claims and factual claims. 25% of students pick this answer choice as if this answer choice is equivalent to this set of words, right? Whereas, if you just look at this, this is factual, right? This is just factual. We're just stating as a matter of fact, if you're deciding between these two hypotheses, as a matter of fact, this one is the one that's more likely, right? It's just more likely that this is the hypothesis that explains the phenomenon. I'm not saying like, oh, if something and something were true, then something else, would be true. Do you see? But that's exactly what E says. If the authors of novel X and Y are from very similar backgrounds, have led very similar lives, which we know they have, sure, right? So in argument, this is, again, a factual, right? A factual claim. Both authors are from very similar backgrounds, have led similar lives. E puts it as a conditional. Right? If that were true, then what? Then suspicions that either of the authors plagiarized, right? This plagiarism hypothesis is what? See, now this answer choice commits another mistake. It conflates the fact that comparatives are relative with something that's absolute, right? What should it have said to avoid, to sidestep this mistake? It shouldn't have said suspicions that either of the authors plagiarized are very likely to be unwarranted. It should have said suspicions that either of the authors plagiarized are less likely to be true than that this is merely a coincidence. That's what E should have said if it wanted to avoid this mistake, right? Do you see what I mean? Like, that's the mistake. Another way of thinking about this is like, if the mistake here is if I told you Shiming is taller than Emma, and then you say, oh, well, Shiming is very likely to be tall, or Emma is very likely to be short. You don't know that. Just because one is taller than the other doesn't mean that either one is likely to be tall or short. Just like how if this, coincidence is a hypothesis is more likely than this other hypothesis, doesn't mean this other hypothesis is very likely to be not warranted.